Hi, my name is Angela Goodwin, Associate Deputy Attorney General at the Attorney General's Office, and on behalf of the Texas Human Trafficking Prevention Coordinating Council, I would also like to thank you for being here and for participating in this. As Emily said, this is the third of a 5-part series or webinar that the council is hosting. The first one on January 19th was about prevention, assessing the threat of human trafficking in Texas. The second one on protection, which was investigating and conducting human trafficking operations. And last week, TABC, DPS did a really good job of discussing this and discussing how you can use data and algorithms to keep track of establishments to see whether or not they're engaging in drink solicitation practices, whether they have minors, or the importance of data. Next week, we're going to be discussing providing support. The following week will be about partnerships. As discussed, though, today's focus is going to be on prosecution. Some phrases that you'll hear when professionals who handle human trafficking cases, successful trafficking cases, are it's a victim-centered approach. It's a victim-intensive case. We'll be discussing more about that later. Another phrase you're going to hear over and over again today, and for anybody that does these cases on the regular, are collaboration. As it was stated last week, any human trafficking case is too big for one agency. So along those lines, I'd like to talk about the speakers who we're going to have today for our webinar. Can we go to the next slide? So our presenters today, we have a good mix of prosecutors from both urban and rural areas. We have the Honorable Kendall Culpepper, who's the Rockwell County DA, Criminal District Attorney, and Chair of the TDCAA Board of Directors. We have the Honorable Jennifer Tharp, who's the Comal County Criminal District Attorney, and on the TDCAA's Legislative Committee. Myself. We have Jonna Stallings, who's the Chief of Adult Sex Crimes and Trafficking, who will be speaking with us today. And then we have the Chief of the Human Trafficking and Transnational Organized Crime Section here at the Texas Attorney General's Office, Kara Foose-Pierce. And we have Assistant Attorney General Greg Burton, and we have Human Trafficking Survivor Rachel Fisher. We go to the next one, please. We're going to talk more about that strategic plan. As you may have seen in the slides that we're rolling through before we got started, in 2019, the Texas legislature passed Senate Bill 72, which is now in the government code, creating the Prevention and Human Trafficking Prevention Coordinating Council, made up of the Office of the Attorney General, the Governor, DFPS, DPS, Texas Workforce Commission, Health and Human Services, licensing and regulations, Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission, and Texas Parks and Wildlife. And we were tasked with coming up with a 5-year strategic plan to prevent human trafficking. And as part of the plan, we had recommendations in there, which included doing training across all disciplines, using all tools in state and federal court. And we're going to talk more later about administrative sanctions and asset forfeiture and how they can come into play. So these are the strategies that we'll be discussing today as we go forward with the webinar. Thank you.
I'm happy to talk to you today about the strong Texas statutes that we have as prosecutors to use to prosecute human trafficking. But I first want to talk about the problem. Texas has the second highest number of trafficking cases reported to our main entry point of people who are worried about a trafficking case, and that's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. We have been second highest consistently. That means we're looking for the problem of trafficking, but it also means we have a huge problem of trafficking that we have to recognize. Trafficking is a Texas-sized problem. During the last year, there were 1.6 million online commercial sexual advertisements, commercial for commercial sex. 223,000 of those were believed to have been children. So that, I think, shows us what a huge problem we have of trafficking in the state of Texas. Texas has also a huge trafficking statute. We have a statute that covers sex and labor traffickers, people who benefit from sex trafficking workers, and people who engage in sex with sex trafficking victims. And there's a significant punishment range. Most of our trafficking cases have a punishment range of 5 years to 99 years or life in prison when a child is involved or when the trafficking results in death. There's also an enhanced punishment for the continuous trafficking of persons, which is 25 years to 99 years or life in prison. Texas statute is divided into 4 categories: adult labor, adult sex, child labor, and child sex. And when we're talking about trafficking and we're talking about children involved in trafficking, we're talking about under 18. Some of our statutes in Texas involve under 17, but the trafficking statute is for under 18. And so a person who knowingly benefits from a venture that involves trafficking is also guilty of trafficking. And that's important because it covers those who benefit from trafficking as well as the actual people who are harboring, recruiting, providing, or otherwise obtaining a child or a child for sexual services or a person for forced labor. To prove trafficking of an adult, whether for sex or for labor, you have to have force, fraud, or coercion. The same to show labor trafficking of a child. But when we're talking about sex trafficking cases, force, fraud, or coercion is not required for under 18. The strategic plan encourages the use of the human trafficking statutes. Encourages it because human trafficking can be charged along with other charges. Human trafficking doesn't have to be a standalone crime, but the actual penal code says that it can be used along with other offenses. So human trafficking can be charged along with compelling prostitution, along with promotion of prostitution, along with sexual assault or kidnapping or even murder. Human trafficking is a charge that can overlap a lot of other criminal activity, and it should be used so that we can both quantify the problem in Texas and also so that we can give recognition to our victims who very much need to be recognized as human trafficking victims because it opens services for them. It opens crime victims compensation. It opens some civil actions for them as well.
Thank you, Brooke. As I was introduced earlier, my name is Jennifer Tharp, and I'm the Criminal District Attorney for Comal County. And what I'd like to take a few minutes to talk to you about is when we look at the problem of human trafficking, the best way to really appreciate the scope of this problem is not only looking at the distribution side, that is our traffickers, but also looking to the supply side, our victims. But then connected to that supply side also is the demand side. That is our buyers. As prosecutors, definitely in law enforcement, it is just as important to go after the demand side. As long as the demand is always out there, then the victims and the likelihood of the distribution, the traffickers, continue to take place. Things to think about is that if as law enforcement, our investigations are solely focused on the traffickers and we're ignoring the demand side, we're going after one or perhaps two of these important angles of the triangle, and we're going to always have that limited impact. I will tell you, with regards to prosecuting these type of cases, most of our cases have extensive cell phone forensics connected to our investigations. And it can be overwhelming for law enforcement or for the prosecutor when you start going through cell phone downloads and seeing all of the demand that took place for our victims. You may see multiple individuals who have met up with our particular victim, whether it's just one night, one weekend, or perhaps a month. We're talking multiple instances. And as you investigate these cases, looking at the volume, it can feel overwhelming as if there will never be an end to this particular investigation. But I think as prosecutors and as individuals who are focused in on really taking a hard stance of human trafficking, protecting our children and protecting our victims. We need to go with a focused effort after each and every one of the buyers. When you look to how you curb the demand for the crime, we have to step back and understand that real men don't buy girls. And I think as a prosecutor, one of the hardest things to understand is human trafficking victims do not necessarily present as our traditional sexual assault victims. Often with sexual assault victims, there is the understanding, or I guess the societal expectations of how our victim is to behave, whether or not they want to, from a public's perspective, be what we would classify perhaps as rescued. I think when you look at human trafficking victims, we need to try to meet them where they're at. I will tell you, for most of the victims that I have met over the human trafficking cases I've prosecuted, I learn of the horrific sexual abuse that my victim endured. But I think it's short-sighted to stop right there. I think you have to really understand what all took place in our victim's life that led to the situation where she found herself being trafficked. For some of my victims, believe it or not, once they met up with their trafficker, they were finally able to get perhaps the food that they needed, or perhaps other needs that we have every day that we take for granted. The other thing that I had to understand is my human trafficking victims, very often at the very beginning of the investigation or prosecution of the case, might not want to cooperate, may not what we would perceive as being someone willing to participate. It's a hard reality when we step back and try to understand what all our victim has gone through prior to law enforcement coming into the picture. A couple of years ago, or I want to say it was about a year or 2 years ago, our office prosecuted a case, the state of Texas versus James Aaron Lennox. I've pulled a couple of my slides from my closing argument, and I'd like to go through just briefly some of the things that we try to, when we look at a successful prosecution, highlighting. If you'll go to the next slide, please. From the very beginning, even with voir dire, it's, as a prosecutor, I think so important that we educate our jury to understand the dynamic of the abuse that's taking place. This triangle pie chart shows 6 very, very common symptoms, or 6 very common circumstances that human trafficking victims go through, whether it's how the victim was targeted, how the perpetrator, the trafficker, was able to gain trust, how they were able to fill a need, how they then worked to isolate the child or the victim, how they sexualized the relationship, and how they were able to maintain control. As I mentioned a moment ago, it is so important as prosecutors that we really try to understand what our victim has gone through, but equally as important when we're talking to our jury, our community, is that our law enforcement understands. So when they have that first contact with our victim, they're having a successful contact, an understanding contact, a trauma-informed contact with our victim, but also making sure that our community understands. I think as prosecutors, as community leaders, I saw the poll earlier, we've got individuals from all varieties. It is so important that the public understands the nature of this type of offense. There can be public perception of, as I said earlier, how a victim is to behave or how they're supposed to respond. Perhaps they've set these standards by stuff they see on TV or through movies. So with my jury, my typical focus is going through these 6 instances on how a victim can find themselves in this dangerous relationship. And then secondarily, breaking down from my jury from the very beginning of voir dire of these are all of the elements. In this next slide, you'll see with James Lennox, we broke down for the jury from the very beginning how we were going to prove each and every one of the elements. As Brooke mentioned, I do agree it's important to not only charge human trafficking, but also looking at some of the underlying sexual offenses. For the state of Texas, our laws are fantastic in the sense that we can not only prosecute the underlying sexual offenses, but we can also prosecute for the trafficking. In this particular case, we not only alleged the trafficking, but we also alleged all of these sexual offenses you see under the third prong. Things that I like to do throughout the trial is constantly remind my jury of these are my burdens, these are my elements. And then every opportunity I have to tie back for the jury in my closing arguments, this is the evidence you saw, and this is how I met the element. In this next slide, you'll see actually an image from the cell phone forensics. As a prosecutor, it does take a long time with our smartphones that we have today. There's a lot of evidence you have to comb through, but due diligence and extensive digging in these cell phones often will lend weight in so many ways. In this particular case, we found images of our victim in the defendant's vehicle. Traffic, as the code defines it, includes transport. You've got a photo there for the victim. That jury is able to find that defendant guilty, and not solely just on the victim's word, but we're corroborating each and everything that the victim outcried. And then this next slide, you'll see different text messages sent by the defendant to my victim that again corroborated it. It showed the defendant asking for particular sexual favors that made it clear. It gave me a date, it gave me a time range, and it takes some of the burden off of my victim to be able to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that not only was this victim trafficked, but in this particular case, the trafficker was also sexually abusing her. In this next slide, you can see some of the unique challenges for prosecution. As I mentioned, victims often can blame themselves, but I'm going to next kick it over to our next presenter.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. I'm Kara Pierce from the Texas Attorney General's Office, and I'm going to talk to you about the second aspect of our strategic plan, which has to do with making sure that prosecutors that are prosecuting human trafficking cases are trained and in this specific area so that they can be successful. There are prosecutors who've been prosecuting for many, many years that I used to work with, and that I even sometimes work with now, who have never done a trafficking case. And sometimes from the outside looking in, they don't understand what the differences are. But as Jennifer already highlighted, there are definitely some differences in these cases that if the prosecutor is aware of it, it can help the case become more successful. First of all, trafficking victims do not always cooperate immediately with law enforcement. And that can both be a challenge for law enforcement and sometimes a challenge for the prosecutor. Why do trafficking victims, why do they behave differently than maybe a different type of sexual assault victim or a robbery victim? They distrust law enforcement. Traffickers train their victims and teach their victims to distrust law enforcement. They say things like, I'm not the one who's going to go to jail if the cops find you, you are, because you're the one who's breaking the law. You're the one who's committing commercial sex acts. Another reason why trafficking victims sometimes are different is that they don't identify as victims. Oftentimes they feel like it's their fault they're in the situation that they're in, that they made bad choices, that it's their fault. And so therefore they don't realize at the time that they are being exploited. So they're less likely to cooperate with law enforcement. And this isn't unique to trafficking cases, but it is very prevalent in trafficking cases. They fear for their own personal safety or the safety of their family. The fundamental aspect, the underlying thing we see in almost every trafficking case is control. Traffickers exert control over their victims through threats, through actual violence, through threats of embarrassment, harm to their family. And because that's how they compel victims to do their bidding, that same fear will oftentimes prevent victims from wanting to cooperate in the system. Also, that along those same lines of the coercion and the threats, human traffickers develop something called the trauma bond with their victim. And what that does is it's sometimes people refer to it as almost Stockholm syndrome. What will happen is they will create, you saw the triangle chart that Jennifer showed us, they'll build trust at first. They'll fill a need of the victim. They'll identify the victim's vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And as they go through that process of manipulation with the victim, they create a bond that creates loyalty on behalf of the victim for their trafficker. And sometimes it's hard for people on the outside looking in to understand that. Next page. So why is it so important that we train prosecutors about these issues? If prosecutors are aware of the issues coming in, then they will be able to better assess the evidence and put together a case that can be successful. It is very important to recognize as a prosecutor that talking about these issues with a victim can re-traumatize them. Sometimes I've had experiences with victims where they'll sit in my office and we'll be talking about normal things, and they are normal, bubbly teenagers. And the minute that you show them a photo of their trafficker, or the minute you bring up his or her name, their entire demeanor changes. You can see them physically shutting down, hunching over. And so while it is important for a successful prosecution for victims sometimes to testify, anything that we can do to limit the necessity for that by finding other strong corroborating evidence, like Jennifer mentioned, and also limiting the amount that they have to testify to, can definitely help avoid that re-traumatization. Another thing I always try to do is have an advocate present for the victim, even while we're preparing them for trial, definitely during trial or any kind of testimony, but making sure that they have that support to help deal with that situation. Another thing that's important for prosecutors to understand is the unique nature of human trafficking relationships. Because there is a level of coercion and manipulation involved, sometimes there may be one primary trafficker. In the sex context, that would be the pimp. There may also be another secondary trafficker who may also be a victim, him or herself. So in the context of sex trafficking, there's a pimp, and we often call the other trafficker a bottom girl. Well, bottom girls are often in the situation that they're in because they're victims themselves. They either have been in the past or they are now. And so they are both sometimes a defendant and a victim in the same case. And so that's something that's really important for all of us to be aware of when we're prosecuting these kind of cases and making charging decisions, to identify if, yes, maybe there was an adult who helped offer a child for commercial sex purposes, but that adult may be victimized themselves. And that's important as we weigh how to proceed with regard to that person. Also, victims don't outcry very often, which makes it challenging. And sometimes their outcries are delayed. Something that I mentioned before, it's great and important to enlist victim services on behalf of victims from the beginning of cases. Don't wait until a trial's about to start, because those services can go into place and stabilize a victim early on, and that can create continuity and support for them throughout the process. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of coercion and power in the dynamic between a trafficker and a victim, and they try to exert that once they're charged. So they will tamper with witnesses in human trafficking cases at a very high rate. And what does that tampering look like? Sometimes it's threats against them or their family, overt threats. Sometimes it's subtle threats, and sometimes it's just manipulation. Sometimes they'll get a family member to call the victim and say, "Oh, you don't want to do this. This guy loves you," or something along those lines. Another thing that's unique in trafficking cases is sometimes a case will present to a prosecutor like a kidnapping or a sexual assault, and there'll be an underlying aspect of trafficking there, and trained prosecutors will know to look for that, and that can be important in the case. And as you can tell from this presentation and all the different speakers we have, these cases are hard to do in a vacuum. It's important to utilize your resources, utilize your non-government organizations, your social services organizations, other law enforcement, and other prosecutors to help get it done. Another reason why it's great to have trained prosecutors is because of how complex and time-consuming these cases are. Oftentimes, there's more to the story than just one trafficker and one victim. There may be multiple traffickers and multiple victims all working together. There may be multiple traffickers sharing one victim or buying and selling a victim amongst themselves. And as Jennifer also mentioned, there's a lot of technical evidence. A lot of sex trafficking in particular, the recruitment and even the advertising is online. And so getting through and filtering through what's important from a mass amount of evidence, it can be really challenging. As I mentioned before, sex trafficking organizations may have positions that are both victims and offenders, and being aware of those issues. And in some cases, trafficking cases can also involve immigration issues, either on the part of the trafficker or the victim, or both. For all these reasons, the Coordinating Council and the Trafficking Task Force, and all believe that we need to, and we're going to continue to encourage specialized training for law enforcement and prosecutors in this area to help all the prosecution offices in Texas successfully prosecute these cases. And as I mentioned before, just as there can be unique situations with regard to somebody being a trafficker and also being a victim, oftentimes victims may end up in the criminal justice system as defendants themselves. And that's something important for all prosecutors to keep an eye out and be aware of, whether they prosecute trafficking cases or not. The same vulnerabilities that attract traffickers to a person and say that this person will be, I can prey upon them easily. Those vulnerabilities are the very same things that can cause them to end up in criminal trouble themselves. Some examples: homelessness, drug addiction, lack of a stable family, mental health issues, a history of prior abuse, and for children, frequent runaways. Some of those same factors that make them likely victims of trafficking can also make them fall into the criminal justice system. And now Jonna is going to talk a little bit more about that.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jonna Stallings. I'm the Division Chief of Adult Sex Crimes and Trafficking here in Houston at the Harris County District Attorney's Office. So we can go to the next slide, thanks. And it's so important for advocates, social services, prosecutors, anyone in law enforcement to be aware that an individual who is involved in selling in prostitution can be a defendant and can also be a victim. And we have to carefully look out for those individuals, which in my experience, 60 to 70% of those arrested for prostitution selling easily have human trafficking red flags that if one knows to look for those red flags, one will see that a person is actually not voluntarily committing the charged offense. And probably in the rest of the 30%, I'd say at least 20% of those have either been a victim in their background or are currently a victim. They're just not the obvious red flags with those individuals. But voluntarily is that key word in could impact whether they voluntarily committed the charged offense of prostitution selling. Voluntary is an interesting word. A person can have psychological issues going on from a background of sex abuse. It has nothing to do with currently with what's happening to this person, but often the question is, why does this girl, why does this guy keep going out, committing prostitution over and over? We save her and then she's back out on the street. You'll see that with runaways, you'll see that with adults. And it's really not a voluntary act that they're doing. We find that over 90% of the mostly gals that we've interviewed over the past 4 years who are involved in prostitution selling as adults have background in sexual or physical abuse as children. That impacts a person, the trauma impacts a person psychologically. And so they may even think that they're voluntarily going out and committing these acts, but because of their background and a person who's currently manipulating the individual, such as a trafficker, they're really not voluntarily engaging in the activity. So the other issue can be because of love manipulation by the trafficker, could be force, physical force through strangulation, through beating the person being trafficked. That's how the trafficker is controlling the individual. And often a prosecutor will find a background as a victim in family violence. Many of our sellers have been victims of family violence, and that's a red flag for trafficking. Very often the abuser is also the trafficker. So it's important for prosecutors to carefully review, same with law enforcement, carefully review of the background of the seller that's being arrested, the person that's being prosecuted for selling for commercial sex. Because you can also look at CPS records. You can look at the postings to see whose email address, whose telephone numbers are associated with the posting. It may not even be your gal or guy who was arrested for selling. Look at contacts with law enforcement, that assault, family violence that I talked about. That abuser is your likely trafficking suspect. Carefully look at cell phones. As a prosecutor, when evidence is collected during the course of the prostitution arrest, you need to take a look at it. You need to look and see what are the text messages in the phone, what are the photos, what are the postings. And so you can really make an educated decision on what needs to happen to the defendant. Should the case be dismissed? If a person is a victim through force, fraud, coercion, absolutely the cases should be dismissed. In fact, as soon as that person is safe, connect the person to services. In Harris County, we dismiss the charges. We don't require that they cooperate, should be dismissed. Also look at social media. You can easily use Spotlight and other databases to search and see where are the other postings that this person is being posted, what cities. And so that way you can look for mitigation. We have had several gals that are adults. They're posting with children. They might be posting with a 16-year-old. You can see the picture in the post for commercial sex. She's the one that gets picked up for compelling prostitution, for trafficking the juvenile. Need to look closely. Is she actually the only trafficker involved? Is she being forced? Is there another higher up person? Often we see a web of traffickers, and we will charge engaging in organized criminal activity, put all the people together using criminal analysis. And we find in the cell phones, for example, that our gal that's arrested for trafficking, the juvenile, is actually being forced over a period of time by the higher up trafficker, the pimp, maybe a male, could be a female. And so you need to carefully evaluate your evidence. Now, it may be mitigating for this current individual, this gal who's charged with trafficking. It may be mitigating that she has sex abuse in her background, or that she's currently being forced to engage in this activity. Maybe you reduce the charge, maybe you give her deferred adjudication. So it's all about striving to be fair and considering the complete situation of every defendant, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony, to carefully evaluate. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, thanks. So when we're talking about misdemeanor selling offenses, those arrests, I'm not talking about the traffickers or the felonies, there's a variety of ways to handle those individuals. We have now, I was counting like 5, 6, 7 ways that we divert our potential victims, either current victims, or like I said, I believe they're usually going to be victims in the past, victims of sexual or physical abuse as children. So I want to help them. So I use a variety of ways, a variety of techniques. One is a pre-arrest diversion. So we encourage our law enforcement to, when a person has been detained for sex selling, to offer opportunities instead of arrest. And a lot of times what law enforcement does in Harris County is they will have forensic nursing services, adult forensic interviewers, advocates, criminal analysts, all on scene during the operation. So that way an accurate view can be gathered on the sex seller. So we can look to see what's her background right then and there at the time of detention. She can be put with an advocate immediately upon detention. She also has the opportunity for forensic examination if she needs medical care. And then officers will actually offer to the detained seller, hey, if you're interested on another day, you can come back and talk to a forensic interviewer, talk about whatever you want to talk about. And a lot of the times, the gals and guys arrested for prostitution selling say, I want to talk right now. And we had 20 successful pre-arrest diversions in 2020, and 15% of those, 3 people, outcried about their trafficker. We also have post-arrest diversion, which we have 2 different diversion programs, and those programs can be one, a little longer term, like 4 months. If someone needs extensive drug treatment, they can also get a forensic interview, an opportunity to talk about whatever they want to talk about. It's not required that they give information on anybody. It's just their opportunity to have a trauma-informed interview. And there's also a really short diversion, which is basically go meet with a forensic interviewer, talk about whatever you want to talk about, and then your case is dismissed. That's another form of post-arrest diversion. We also do unofficial diversion, where we reset the case of the seller, let her meet with an advocate. The advocate talks, this is all assuming defense attorney agrees. The advocate has conversation with the defendant and says, you know, I think it'd be good for her to get into a shelter. She'd like some medical care. So she's homeless. I can make sure she gets free medical care. Those, you know, those kind of situations. And then we reset it until she gets situated, until she gets into the shelter, she gets her medical care. And then maybe we just dismiss the case. And sometimes that takes 6 months to a year, but we've had success with that also, where gals have gone on to be successful in their lives and get apartments and jobs. It's just a matter of working with the particular situation that the defendant may have. Last year, we dismissed almost 400 misdemeanor arrests. And that's through a variety of ways that we are dealing with the different defendants, depending on their needs. And it's all about being trauma informed and preventing future exploitation of that individual. And we don't arrest for prostitution anyone under the age of 18. So you can go to the next slide, thanks. So on a day-to-day basis, this is what we do to catch traffickers. So I've told you about diversion. I've told you some of the ways that we handle misdemeanor arrests. This is what we do on the flip side to catch traffickers. We have a team, a task force that works with a variety of law enforcement agencies. Their officers work out of our office. They work hand in hand with prosecutors, along with the criminal analysts. And our criminal analysts look at about 420 subjects every month. And they evaluate misdemeanor seller arrests. They also look at tips that we get from outside agencies or other prosecutors. And they review and look at the background, the cell phones, the social media, all the things I told you earlier prosecutors should be looking at. They develop a suspect, hand that suspect information over to the investigator to wrap up the case with search warrants or follow-up interviews. And the whole goal is to, for these cases, to proceed without a victim, because we want to pursue our cases without a victim. And so we have filed over the past 3 years, we have filed about 170 cases on traffickers that would have otherwise gone undetected by law enforcement. Just yesterday, we had a defendant plead to 6 years where we had no victim ever. We put the case together based upon criminal analyst looked at a seller arrest, found that she had been abused by an individual. They were able to put together a circumstantial case of promotion without her, and got some of his jail calls, put it all together, prosecuted him, and he's now off to prison. And he would have skated by if not for this program. So I think this is a great way to reduce your dismissals as well, because we used to have a high dismissal rate for no victim or insufficient evidence, but it's all about gathering all the circumstantial evidence from social media, cell phones, postings, contacts with law enforcement, put it all together so that way when victims are afraid to come forward or victims are do shut down because of their fear or their trauma, like Kara talked about, we can still go forward and we can still send these people to prison that are hurting our adults and our juveniles. So thank you so much. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Jenna. Kinda, if you want to pick up here, that'd be great. I turned my video on, but I guess y'all want to hear it too. Well, good afternoon. My name is Kenda Culpepper. I'm the district attorney in Rockwall County, right outside of Dallas. And I was really excited to be asked to speak about partnerships because I believe that partnerships are key in the state of Texas and nationally, because quite frankly, communication is key. So that's what's so exciting about a forum like this and being able to talk about this stuff. And I can tell you that prosecutors, we have to be talking about these issues because these issues not only affect every jurisdiction, but because we're going to be handling the same cases, the same defendants. These traffickers are mobile. They are moving their victims from county to county to county, and we've got to be talking so that we're not wasting time retreading the same ground. We can rely on resources throughout the state to get information about these traffickers and be able to better prosecute them. So we've got to be talking to each other. And it's not only county prosecutors, if you'll stay on that last slide, it's not only county prosecutors, it's also federal prosecutors. It's also not just prosecutors, it's federal and county law enforcement. And I have to say that we've got to create these relationships now. That's why these are, again, so important, because when you've got that case and you need to talk to someone, it's too late to start developing relationships. It's too late to try to introduce yourself. You've got to be able to act as quickly as possible. And I saw that someone was asking questions about giving some examples of partnerships and the way that we've worked with people in human trafficking situations. And I'll give a couple of examples. Recently in Rockwall County, law enforcement responded to a woman who said that she had just escaped a house in Rockwall. She had left a party with another man who took her to a house in Rockwall in which women were kept in cages. And as soon as the DA's office found out about what was going on, we were able to immediately start mobilizing resources to catch that perpetrator and find services, which again is very important. All of the people on this call know that, finding services for that victim as soon as possible. And I can tell you, when we started making calls and mobilizing resources, it turns out that Dallas County had already been looking at this exact same suspect. They had great information that allowed us to move forward very quickly. We contacted the federal prosecutors, and they've gotten involved in that. Now they've taken the case. They have great resources. So that's just one example. Another example is DEA was working on a drug case, and they got information that during that, when they were doing surveillance, they got information that girls had been trafficked out of a hotel room. The agent and I were friends. He called me and said, "Hey, listen, I want to let you know about that. They're also moving these girls from county to county to county." So I got on the phone with prosecutors in 3 different counties, and we started immediately working to determine if we could prosecute that trafficker in multiple jurisdictions at once. There was no reason to start from scratch. We wanted to work those cases together. We wanted to figure out which county had the best case, which county had the best case of success, because quite frankly, it's not about territorialism. It's about getting bad guys off the street. And so we all had our individual prosecutions with our own prosecutors, but those were working as a regional team, and they continue to do so. And I can tell you that we even talked about doing a joint press release, making sure that, because that prosecutors are working together, but not only that, to build awareness, to continue building awareness about these issues, because I can tell you that it is shocking how many in law enforcement and prosecution are just now arriving at the show. Prosecutors work together. Prosecutors' offices across the state of Texas are doing such great work. But human trafficking is a relatively new issue in our world. And we need to work not only to increase that awareness in the public, but also to increase awareness with law enforcement. I can tell you that quickly, I was at a conference not too long, well, actually it's been years ago, and I was talking about human trafficking and that we needed to increase awareness. And I had just heard the statistic that 300,000 children across the nation were victims of human trafficking. And I remember having this question of how in the world is that possible? I mean, 300,000 children, we're not hearing about kids being kidnapped off the street and sold to hostile slave countries. You know, what's going on? Because that's what I thought about human trafficking. Again, this was a decade ago. But the presenter and I talked afterwards, and she was telling me about the throwaway children and runaways that no one knew were even being sold because no one cared enough to even report that they were missing. And I remember during that conference, one of the speakers that I was speaking with came to me and she was like, talk to me about this human trafficking stuff, because we're not filing cases like what you're talking about, 300,000 people. And we talked about the fact that victims often were unwilling participants, not just that, hey, prostitution is their job. These are unwilling participants. I don't know any 13-year-old girls that want to be raped repeatedly by a strange man night after night after night. And that's when I realized that we have got to increase awareness across the board. All right, next slide. So stakeholder partnerships. So there are so many people that are on this call, and I'm excited to be able to talk to so many different people because it's about education. First, you've got to know who you can partnership with, and sometimes those partnerships are not so obvious. Last year, the governor's office invited some of us to attend a summit in Baton Rouge and on human trafficking. And I remember thinking, okay, another conference. We've all felt that way, right? But at the time, I didn't know what the superwoman Andrea Sparks was, but I can tell you it turned out to be one of the most valuable conferences I have ever attended because first, I was shocked at how much I didn't know about human trafficking. And this is a task force that had been created. And I thought I'd been really proactive about the issue. And I thought at least I recognized that it existed and I was talking about it. But I hadn't been talking about talking to the other stakeholders because quite frankly, I didn't know who they were. That summit was an amazing opportunity to talk to other people who were involved in these issues, find out what they did, determine how we could work together. For example, I knew a lot of the prosecutors and the law enforcement agencies, but I was amazed at what they were accomplishing in these other jurisdictions. Jana was there and I was amazed. I was rapt listening to the things that they were doing in Houston and how imaginative they were about prosecuting the bad guys and filtering out who the victims were. And that's when those creative juices started flowing. I didn't realize that the Department of Licensing was so effective, TABC so effective, because where we can't get into a bar or a massage parlor, they could. Because those people want to keep their licenses. And so I remember Brooke that you've heard about, Brooke and I and Judge Wheelis in Collin County were talking about regional human trafficking courts because we can't necessarily, like Houston, maybe support a human trafficking court in our own jurisdictions, but together we can. And so we talked to DPS, we talked to the AG's office. We created an amazing relationship with the AG's office, Angela, that you heard talking about how we can help each other and not just, hey, let me know if I can help, I'll see you later, but asking the question, what are we going to do right now to start working on these issues and working together and gathering resources and not just talk, but what are some solutions to moving forward? I met so many people there, and I can tell you that these task forces are so important for a number of reasons. They allow you to work on cases together, you meet other stakeholders, and it encourages a free flow of ideas, creating new ways to enforce the law and prosecute the bad guys. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the MDTs. So many of us have children's advocacy centers in our region, and MDTs are an incredibly important part. Those of you who are in law enforcement and the mental health field and medical field know how important those MDTs are to not only us working on a case, being able to prosecute that case, but also the comprehensive approach to dealing with the victims in those cases, because we can put bad guys away, and we do every day. But the victim is still broken. And if they don't get help, they potentially can become abusers themselves. For the last year, I've served on the Children's Advocacy Centers of Texas statewide multidisciplinary team. And that has been another great opportunity to talk to other stakeholders about how we can work together on these child abuse issues. Law enforcement, prosecutors, doctors, CAC executive directors, mental health counselors, CPS. We're busy finding out how we can combat these issues together as a group. And at the state level, we're also talking about emerging issues. For example, we've been talking about child pornography, the gateway drug for child abusers, and so many other task forces like the governor's office. And then the last slide that I'm going to be talking about is cases in the headlines. If you can go to the next slide. This is why we've got to increase awareness. We hear every year that the Super Bowl is one of the largest gatherings of sex traffickers because they have the largest pool of buyers. And for some reason, prostitution is still widely, though secretly, accepted. And it reminds me kind of where we were with family violence 2 decades ago. Why are we prosecuting this? They don't want to prosecute. The victims won't want to prosecute. Why are we prosecuting it? But we've got to understand that human trafficking is wrong and must be stopped. I mean, these people are being sold. And we can start by changing terminology, changing the conversation, increasing awareness throughout the community. And I can say that the one that you see on the screen, the Rockwall Police Arrest 4 on trafficking, that particular case was about a family who sold their daughter to a group in Chicago for sex. And when that group didn't pay what they were supposed to, they repossessed their daughter like a piece of property and tried to sell her to another group in another state. This is happening. It's real. All of you know that. And people have got to know about it. And that's why it's so important to get this awareness through the media. I was glad to see that there's some media outlets that are involved here today, because people were shocked when this news came out in the very affluent Rockwall County, but it demonstrated that if it's happening here, it's happening everywhere. Too many times people want to put their hands over their eyes and say, this can't be real. That kind of evil does not exist, but it does. And we've got to do something about it. Thank you so much. And I'll kick it to the next speaker.
So in the spirit of collaboration and cooperation, the AG's office recently launched something called the HT Blue Line, and it's intended to provide support to law enforcement and prosecutors that had human trafficking specific questions. So here's the phone number, and we would encourage any of you all out there that are law enforcement or prosecutors that maybe have a specific trafficking related question and you want someone to talk it through, please give us a call. So you've heard a whole lot about prosecutions, criminal prosecutions, and that is a huge and important aspect of holding traffickers accountable here in the state of Texas, but we have other ways to do so as well. First, civil lawsuits. And you may have heard that there are some civil lawsuits going on around the state of Texas holding different entities who may help facilitate trafficking accountable. I definitely heard about a lawsuit in Houston where some hotels were being sued by victims of trafficking who said that they didn't do enough to protect them. That's a great example. There have been civil lawsuits filed against some of the commercial exploitation websites where people are offered for commercial sex, and victims are now suing them saying you didn't do enough or you purposely facilitated my exploitation. There's several different civil statutes. We have one that allows the AG's office to go after traffickers and those who are facilitating trafficking and sue on behalf of victims as well. And why does civil matter so much? Sometimes civil can reach into areas where, for whatever reason, there isn't quite enough evidence to do a criminal prosecution, or there just aren't the resources to do a criminal prosecution. And what is at the heart of human trafficking? It's exploitation, but it's exploitation for profit. And so when you go after traffickers' money, when you seize their vehicles, you seize their houses, you seize their jewelry, you seize their commercial space that they're using to exploit labor victims, then you're shutting it down. Because if you take away their motivation and you threaten their motivation, that can help deter the crime. Similarly, administrative actions. Right now, our office is engaged in something called the Landlord Engagement Program. We were shocked to find out how many storefront brothels there are throughout the state of Texas. The last number I heard was over 1,000 storefront brothels, many of which are operating under the guise of massage parlors, but they're not actually licensed massage businesses, where sex acts are happening. And so we're enlisting commercial property owners and educating them on this problem to try to prevent them from leasing to these types of storefront brothels in the future, and letting them know what to do if they find out they are leasing to someone. And they can use their administrative means like eviction to get those traffickers out of their commercial space. Also, similarly, the community engagement, but also the city attorneys and county attorneys are using nuisance laws and other things that are local available to them to seize and shut down problematic businesses.
Right, thank you, Kara. So now we are very fortunate to have Rachel Fisher from the Human Trafficking Survivor Leaders Council. The Survivor Leaders Council was able to provide us their perspective and recommendations on the 5-year strategic plan. Rachel, I'm going to let you kind of take over here, and you'll be able to give us some of your thoughts as a representative of the council.
Thanks, Emily. I'm happy to be here. This list of ladies in front of you, these are 12 ladies who are on the council with me, and we have been given this opportunity to have a voice again, to be able to review and review materials, review plans, review presentations and strategies, and to give a survivor voice to it, to be able to collectively take our individual backgrounds. We all come from different views, but we have been through the same struggles. So for us to be able to lend a voice, to be able to help partners that are in this fight on our behalf, to be able to do so with a survivor informed view has been very great. So everyone listed here is part of that. For me personally, what got me into this aspect of it and why this Prosecute lecture was near and dear to my heart. I was trafficked at 15 years of age, and I was in the foster care system. But my father was the leader of an organization who trafficked women, and my mother was trafficked by him. And my mother has been in and out of prison my entire life. And I always, even growing up, I thought of her as a terrible person for being in prison. And then once I learned about trafficking and what my father was actually doing with all these ladies being auctioned off at the clubhouse, I realized my mother was a victim. But she back then didn't have a defense attorney that understood it. She didn't have a system who understood that she was a victim. And so she's spent her entire life in prison. And then my brother, he was murdered when I was 13 years old with gang violence. But him and my father, they used to always tell me, Rachel, you got to go to school, you got to be a lawyer, you got to help us get off of our criminal charges, you got to be a criminal defense attorney. So I didn't do that, but I became a SANE nurse. Once I got out, I went to nursing school, became a forensic nurse, and now I do legal nurse consulting. So I help attorneys, both criminal defense attorneys, civil attorneys, as well as prosecutors understand trafficking better. And I've been able to testify as an expert in state and federal court on human trafficking, domestic violence, recantation, strangulation, and so on and so forth. So it's been very important to me. And the survivor perspective being brought into what the systems level is doing is significant, and it is what's going to make the change. Our mission is to be able to review these things and give a survivor-informed as well as a trauma-informed approach, to be able to see sustainable change across the system that is at the systems level, that's with a survivor's voice, that's done right and able to be effective. The main 3 points after we did our review of what is being presented here is the victim offender overlap and the intersection. It's something that needs to be addressed. And when it comes to their day in court and the trial process, to have a successful prosecution shouldn't be the ultimate goal. It should be to have a fair and just prosecution, so that both on the defense side, the prosecution side, all things are viewed. Because a lot of times there is that intersectionality where we have criminal charges against us as victims, but really we were running drugs for the pimp, or we were getting involved in something because we had to and we didn't have a choice. And there's all these different intersections. So to be able to see that, even if we're sitting on the other side of the bench and you're prosecuting and you have a bottom girl that is the defendant, to understand what happened in our life, how we got there to be on trial. And one of the biggest recommendations from everything is to if where possible, and I know there's a lot of limitations, but to have an impact court where there's a judge that's specifically set to trafficking trials, to understand both labor and sex trafficking, to understand definitions, to understand the lingo that's used, just the terminology. It's like speaking Spanish to an English person when you talk about the language of the life and trafficking, and to be able to have attorneys who understand both defense and prosecution. I've seen it on both sides where they didn't even fully understand some of the words But we've seen in Harris County a lot. John has been really pushing for experts to be brought in on trials. And so all across the state of Texas, we really need to put an emphasis on bringing experts in to be able to testify, to be able to explain to the judge and the jury what trafficking is, what it means. And I mean, I've testified as an expert, and I've just seen juries' faces as I explain the simplest of things. The common public doesn't understand the basics of trafficking, and people in the general public still understand trafficking as prostitution, and it's this big misconception because women are not prostitutes, they're prostituted. And so that's something that needs to be educated. And when it comes to trial, bringing an expert on board, whether it's a survivor expert that's consulting or a testifying expert, it's going to be key to a successful trial. And the following slides, there's going to be a lot of information. I'm just going to give kind of bullet points. Survivor-led training is key. There's a lot of times where survivors, where training is done, but survivors aren't a part of it. And the state's been doing a good job at bringing survivors in to be able to help with the training. So that's a big one, to be able to have law enforcement, all of the multidisciplinary aspects of it, lawyers, judges, to be able to hear the survivor point of view and recommendations on how, from our experience, how we think things should go, could have done better in our situations, and to be able to educate on best practices based on our experience in the systems. And then to have less of a reliance on victim testimony, because it's scary when you're sitting in the courtroom and you have you're on the stand and you have a courtroom full of your pimp and his family and the sisters in the life, and you know everybody's waiting for you. It's terrifying. So to be able to step in and to lend a voice for them with experts that are able to, such as a SANE nurse. If they get a SANE exam and the SANE nurse is able to come testify and have the medical hearsay exemption to be able to give the words of what was used for diagnosis and treatment of the patient when they first came in, that's key. So getting a SANE exam at the beginning of the process, or a forensic exam at some point, so that the forensic nurse can testify using that exemption, is key. So that's something that needs to be brought forward. And then when we're talking about resources, the state of Texas has thousands. The city of Houston has hundreds of nonprofits, NGOs, faith-based organizations that fight trafficking. So to be able to have a list that you can give them to choose from on what works best for you, what suits your needs, what location, what modality works for you, and giving them that autonomy back to choose what works for them, as opposed to saying, we have 2 that we work with, choose from them. That's a big one, because if they're limited and if there's only certain service organizations that they're able to go through because of a certain organization, you're kind of taking that control back. And so that's a big one. The main thing here, I mean, we've already discussed how the victims we're forced to do other crimes. It's not just here, go have sex for money. It's here, go run these drugs for us. You have so many blackmail, like, threats against you. There's so many things that they have on any of the drop phones, and they keep the phones and they compile all their blackmail to use against you. So there's so many things that a victim can get in trouble for and catch a case for. And so that's their biggest fear, is to catch a case for something that they were doing for their pimp. And that's really a big one. Being able to do training to lawyers, to civil, criminal, just the whole legal system. It's important that they get, because you guys go through a lot of education that we know nothing about, but we know a lot about trauma. And so to be able to have trauma training for the whole system, to be able to understand what recantation is and why, to understand the neurobiology of trauma, that's something that should be brought in across the board, so that when you do have these victims come in, you understand the trauma behind it to better formulate your questions and your interviews with them before everything even starts. And then survivor engagement throughout all the steps, throughout all aspects of it. The big thing here is, when you engage survivors, whether you're doing a conference, a training, whether you're bringing them in on a case, to look at each survivor as a whole and say, okay, it's not just your story, it's not just what you went through, but now you have some expertise, you have some skin in the game that we can learn from. So to elevate the survivors you work with and the victims you work with, and allow them to understand that they are now an expert at some level where you aren't, and to be able to collaborate with that, and to not just have them speak or to train and share their story of what happened to them, but to give their expertise from what they've gained in life throughout that experience. And then it's not just the story, but it's that story woven through their journey, and how their journey and their steps taken through, how they can help you with that. So looking at the whole aspect of it. And then giving resources early on, that's key. Talking about, I mean, with labor trafficking, sex trafficking, talking about U visas, T visas, acknowledging those fears that we have early on in the process, and just saying, here are resources that are available later on. Here are things that can help you, and acknowledging that elephant and that fear in the room before they even bring it up to you, or acknowledging fear and just saying it. You know, people in the past have said that they're afraid because their trafficker has said X, Y, and Z, or that their daddy has said X, Y, and Z. Because I mean, we don't say human trafficking. We're not victims of human trafficking. We've been in the game. We've been in the life. So we look at it different than you do. So using our language and not your language is key. And so instead of saying, so what was it like when you were trafficked? Tell me more about your trafficker. Saying, tell me more about your family situation, because they bring you in as a family, and you have the daddy, and you have the madam, you have your mama, you have your wifey-in-law. Using the language that they use to you when you're talking to them, and when they say even simple things, the language they use, like when we're giving you our history of what happened, and we say something like, he hit my pussy with his dick so hard. I know that's crash, but these are the things that we say. When you go back to us and you say, so when your vagina was hurt by his penis, we shut down. If you change the words that we give you, and you use politically correct terms, or you use legal terms that we don't understand, we're going to shut down and we're going to turn. But when you can speak the language of the life, and when you can learn from other survivors and bring them in, have them give you a class on here's what these terms mean, just hire one to consult on your case, and just to review everything, and to explain to you what you're looking at, what you're reading, so that you don't waste your precious time and hours on trying to read through what she said to the police, read through everything, but to understand what those mean from the beginning is going to change the trajectory of your case. And so, but it's really important to use the language that we use. Clemency is a big thing. So we've had a lot of survivor sisters that they're not even able to go to beauty school because they have a felony on their record. They're not able to go to college, and their biggest dream is to be able to be successful. And the only way they've been successful is with their pimp selling them a dream, and being the CEO pimp of saying, we're going to be successful together. So being able to have pro bono attorneys, which we have resources all over that do that, to be able to clear their cases, defense attorneys that are able to understand and take those cases for these girls to help them clear the record is really key to their future, their success, and being able to give survivors a voice again, not just as a victim, but as an expert.
Thank you, Rachel, for sharing your expertise and sharing your journey. Thank you for the recommendations.
I know Brooke mentioned earlier different charges that are brought. One thing that I didn't hear mentioned was a strangulation charge. So we did a survey with hundreds of victims of trafficking, and one of the main things that was done to them during their time, either by the Johns or by the pimps, was that they were strangled. They say that they were choked, and they don't even bring it up, really. So when you're interviewing and you ask them, did anybody ever place their hands on your neck in any point? And then you go further into that, because it's sometimes hard to prove compelling or trafficking but if you bring in a strangulation charge, because that's something that happens in 90% of the cases, strangulation was involved. So if you add that to it and nothing else can go through, but you can prove that and have a strangulation expert come testify and to review that, that's significant. Because in a review of hundreds of victims of trafficking that we did a survey on, it was 92% that actually were strangled at some point during their trafficking. And that's a felony in many jurisdictions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We're going to be wrapping up, highlighting our future goals. So we are working on and hoping to develop a statewide real-time human trafficking fusion center for law enforcement. As you've heard from lots of the different women here today, trafficking is often mobile, and we need to stay at the same pace as the traffickers. We don't need to be steps and steps behind, and this will really help law enforcement do that. A comprehensive and easily accessible victim services directory. As Rachel mentioned, there are many, many, many great victim services providers in Texas and in surrounding states. Sometimes it's hard to figure out which one's right for a particular victim. Sometimes it's hard for law enforcement who may recover someone. They may find a labor trafficking victim or adult sex trafficking victim, and they aren't sure what services are available for that particular person in their area. So we're working on trying to come up with a comprehensive directory so that everyone can access that and have it be grouped by region. Improving connections between regional and state trafficking task forces for that same thing, the communication, the partnership opportunities, and funding for comprehensive human trafficking data collection so that we can really allocate resources to the areas that need it within Texas.
Lastly, and again, I'd like to thank you, Rachel. Your insight and input into the life and the language of the life is invaluable. Suggesting adding strangulation is a terrific idea, as I've read that strangulation is the predictor of lethality. So addressing strangulation is very important. Thank you very much. So with the pandemic and the lockdowns, it's been crazy, right? Hearings have moved virtual, trials have been postponed. It's been disruptive to say the least, but as you've heard from the prosecutors who presented today, crimes are still occurring. So justice moves forward, justice doesn't stop. So as we're ending today, and I'd like to thank the participants that are still hanging in there with you, I'm going to give you some concrete steps, because when you hear that there's a problem like this, it's serious, you want to say, what can I do? So here are some concrete steps from small to large. Small, you can get onto the Coordinating Council's mailing list. We'll send you emails of upcoming trainings. You'll be able to access this presentation, for example. Sign up for our social media with the Coordinating Council. Retweet stories of human trafficking, share posts that are going on not just in your part of the world, but in Texas. And why that's important is because there's people that still think that this doesn't exist. Encourage your prosecutor to charge human trafficking. I'd like to give a shameless plug at this point. At the Attorney General's office, we have 7 experienced prosecutors who can come help you with these cases as much or as little as you want. If you have a conflict of interest and you need a pro tem, we can do that. If you want us to handle it first chair and train your prosecutors, we can do that. If you want a second chair, if you want us third chair, if you don't want us in the courtroom at all, but you would like us to help out with your indictment or some of your legal issues, we can do that as well. As we said, the HT Blue line for legal discussions with law enforcement and prosecutors is 512-936-1938. You can also attend more training. Another silver lining of this pandemic is the introduction of Zoom, right? So at one point during the presentation today, we had almost 90 people who were participating. I don't know if we called a 1-hour training if we would get 90 people from around the state. So at least we're able to reach more people that way. And lastly, of course, partnering with whomever you can to attack this. So thank you to all the presenters, and thank you to the 90 participants who joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
All right, thank you, Angela. I think we might have answered all of the questions that are in the queue, but just a reminder, we were blessed with some very fantastic stakeholders and experts in the field and prosecutors today. So I don't see any remaining questions, but if you are staying around, please feel free to pop in. We have our speakers still on the line. While you are here, I know, please join me in thanking our phenomenal speakers. Thank you for our experts today, and thank you for your participation. As Angela said, please reach out to us, find us on social media. We also have, please email us if you have any questions, if you want to get on our mailing list. As I noted in the beginning of the webinar today, we are very fortunate in the AG's office is currently hosting a survivor art exhibit at the Capitol, which some of the survivors have graciously donated their art for this exhibit. It is in the rotunda of the Capitol. We encourage you all to check it out. But for your preview today, we have a sneak peek, so stay on and if you want to see some of the art that we have at the exhibit. And then lastly, just to remind you to join us next week. We'll be talking about providing support to provide follow-up care to victims after recovery. At 12 p.m., just as we have before. So thank you again for all of your time. We'll be here for a little bit longer. Feel free to send us an email, put something in the chat box. Thank you for our speakers. Thank you for the attendees, and enjoy the Survivor Art exhibit.